https://www.youtube.com/watch?v=fmobqdzrhyw. It was the kind of afternoon you wouldn't remember a week later. A typical Wednesday, and I just wrapped up my shift, driving home like I always did. There hadn't been any tension lingering from the night before, no big argument, no strange vibes. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, at least at first. I stepped inside, tossing my keys onto the hallway table out of habit. The TV was on in the living room, showing one of those trashy reality shows she loved, but the sound was muted. Her shoes, those flashy red heels she'd splurged on last month, were lying by the door, almost haphazardly. That struck me as odd. Rachel was borderline obsessive when it came to keeping things tidy. She'd never leave her shoes just lying around like that. I made my way to the kitchen, half expecting to see her there, maybe sipping on that ridiculous detox tea she always swore by. But she wasn't there. In fact, the whole house felt eerily quiet except for the faint buzz of the TV. That's when I noticed her phone, sitting face down on the counter. That was unusual. She never left her phone out like that. A knot formed in my stomach, a vague sense of dread creeping in. It felt like a punch to the gut, but the realization wasn't quite clear yet, just this nagging feeling that something was off, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I picked up her phone, and as the screen lit up, I saw a notification, one unread message. It was from someone named Mark, and I had no clue who that was. The preview was still there for me to read. Last night was wild. When can I see you again? Wild. That word slapped me across the face like a blast of cold water. I stood there, staring at the screen as the edges of my vision blurred, the pieces of the puzzle slowly clicking together. Last night. She'd told me she had to stay late at work, something about a sudden deadline that came out of nowhere, and she needed to stay and finish up. I hadn't doubted her for a second. I never had a reason to. But now, all of that trust was crumbling to pieces. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I could feel the blood surging to my head. The phone trembled in my hand as I stood there, part of me wanting to hurl it across the room, shatter it into a million pieces, and act like I hadn't seen anything. But another part, the part that needed the truth, made me swipe to unlock the phone. I know, it's a breach of privacy. But at that moment, I didn't care. My trust was on the line, slipping away like water through a sieve. I opened the message thread, and there it was, an entire conversation that no husband should ever have to see between his wife and a stranger. Only this guy wasn't a stranger. He was Mark, apparently. The texts were flirty, explicit, filled with things I never thought I'd see her say to anyone else. There were photos, too. Images burned into my memory that I can't ever erase. A wave of nausea hit me hard, like a punch straight to the gut, settling like a weight on my chest, making it almost impossible to breathe. Before I could even start to process what I was seeing, I heard the creak of the door behind me. I spun around. And there she was, Rachel, her hair still damp from a shower, wearing one of my old t-shirts like it was just another day. She looked at me, smiling that smile she always gave, the one that used to melt away all my worries. "You're home early," she said, completely casual, as she walked toward me. I didn't say a word. I just lifted her phone, the screen still lit up with her dirty little secret for both of us to see. Her smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her face when she realized what I was holding. For a second, it felt like the whole house went dead silent, no ticking clock, no sound from the TV, just her staring at the screen in my hand while I stood there, not sure what I was hoping for. An explanation? An apology? I couldn't even say. She opened her mouth as if she was about to say something, but then shut it, clearly at a loss for words. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, trying hard to sound innocent despite the tremble. "It's not what it looks like," she mumbled, forcing calm into her tone. She reached out for her phone, but I yanked it away, not giving her a chance to hide the evidence. Not what it looks like. I shot back, my voice rough and strained, like I'd swallowed gravel. I could feel the anger building up inside me, like a storm gathering strength. Go ahead then. Explain this to me. Last night was wild. What exactly am I supposed to think that means? Her eyes widened in panic for a moment, but she recovered quickly. I'll give her that, she was fast on her feet. I could almost see the gears turning in her head, the lies forming behind those eyes. Mark? He's just a friend, she stammered, taking a small step back as if she needed space to think. We were out with some coworkers, and things got a bit out of hand. But nothing happened, I swear. It's all just a big misunderstanding. I couldn't help it. I actually laughed out loud. The sound was sharp and bitter, even to my own ears. A misunderstanding? I repeated, feeling the heat rise up from my chest. Really? And last night was wild, when can I see you again? That's just a friendly chat, huh? What were you two doing, playing Monopoly? Her face changed, just for a second. It was subtle, but I noticed, the flicker of annoyance, the way her lips pressed together in that tight, thin line I knew too well. She hated it when she wasn't the one in control, and right now, I had her trapped. She crossed her arms over her chest, standing firm, as if digging in for a fight. Look, I told you, it was just some drinks. I didn't mean for it to sound like that. Mark's got a messed up sense of humor, and we'd had a few too many. That's all it was. You're making this into something bigger than it is. I could feel my jaw clenching, my teeth grinding together. Oh, I get it. So tipsy people just casually text about wild nights and making plans to meet up again. Do you think I'm that stupid? She didn't have an answer, couldn't even look me in the eye. Her gaze darted around the room like she was searching for an escape hatch or another excuse that might stick. But there was nowhere for her to go. I had her phone in my hand, and the truth was staring us both in the face. Still, she tried to keep pushing. Why are you acting like this? It's not like I slept with him, she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp, trying to regain control. God, you're overreacting. I'm allowed to have friends. Since when is that some kind of crime? You're acting like a paranoid maniac. Paranoid maniac. Those words hit me harder than I expected. It was like she was trying to twist this around, make it seem like I was the one at fault for catching her in a lie. I looked at her, the woman I'd believed in, the one I'd trusted with everything. And now, all I could see was a stranger standing in front of me. Yeah, friends, I muttered, my voice colder than the anger boiling inside me. Friends you never mentioned. Friends you have to sneak around with, having wild nights, lying about staying late at work, hiding your phone. Sure, that sounds like friendship. Her face turned red with anger now, the fake calm she'd been trying to maintain slipping away. I could tell she hated being backed into a corner, but she was still clawing for a way out. I didn't hide anything, she shot back, her voice rising. You're the one digging through my phone like some jealous, controlling freak. I didn't do anything wrong. That was it. I couldn't listen to her twist this around any longer. My grip tightened on her phone, and I shoved it back at her, practically throwing it into her hands. You didn't do anything wrong. Then what the hell is this? I scrolled up through the messages, thrusting the screen in her face, showing her the pictures, the ones that made me want to throw up. Explain how sending these to Mark is just friendly. Her eyes flashed, and for just a second, the mask slipped. Her lips curled into a sneer, but it was gone almost as soon as it appeared. You're unbelievable, she spat out, her voice dripping with venom. I don't owe you an explanation for anything. I said nothing happened, and if you can't trust that, maybe you should ask yourself why you're so insecure. Maybe this has more to do with you than with me. I stood there, breathing hard, my thoughts racing in circles. Insecure. She was trying to make this about me, turn it around like I was the one with the problem. It was a classic move, make the victim feel guilty. I couldn't believe I was even standing here, listening to her nonsense, but I felt trapped in this whirlwind of emotions, my anger clouding everything else. Something snapped inside me at that moment. I wasn't about to stand there and let her twist everything around. Without saying a word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, heading straight to our bedroom. I grabbed the overnight bag from the closet and started shoving clothes into it without a second thought. She followed me, her voice rising with each step, laced with a new edge of panic. "What are you doing? You're seriously going to walk out over this? Over nothing?" I zipped up the bag and took one final look at her standing there, arms crossed, still holding on to that defiant stance, still trying to twist the narrative. And that's when it hit me, she didn't actually care. Not about me, not about our relationship. She was just upset about getting caught, about losing her grip on the situation. There wasn't a trace of remorse in her eyes. "I'm done," I said quietly but with a firmness I hadn't felt in a long time. Then, without another glance, I walked out the door. As soon as the front door slammed behind me, the pressure that had been building inside me finally erupted. It wasn't relief, it felt more like a volcano finally exploding after years of pressure. I dropped my bag on the porch, my hands trembling as I took a deep breath. The October air was sharp and cold, stinging my skin, but it did nothing to cool the fire raging inside me. I paced back and forth across the small porch, my heart pounding so loud it was all I could hear. I kept replaying those last 10 minutes in my mind, every lie she told, every word she tried to force down my throat. Paranoid, insecure, nothing happened. The way she twisted everything around, making me out to be the bad guy. It was like I didn't even matter to her anymore, just an obstacle she needed to handle. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the contacts. But who was I going to call? My best friend, Dave. He'd tell me to calm down, to take a breather and think it through before making any big decisions. My brother. He'd be livid on my behalf, probably tell me to pack my things and never look back. But advice wasn't what I needed right now. I didn't even know what I wanted. The rage was too raw, too fresh. I couldn't think straight. Suddenly, the door behind me flew open with a bang that echoed through the quiet street. Rachel stood there, framed in the doorway, her face flushed, her eyes wild with anger. I knew that look well, it meant she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "You actually just walked out," she snapped, stepping onto the porch. "You're really packing a bag and leaving over this?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the crisp air like a knife. She stepped closer, arms crossed over her chest like she was daring me to respond. I stayed silent, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I wasn't sure where to even start. I'd walked out to get some distance, to clear my head, and here she was, dragging me right back into the chaos. "Unbelievable," she spat, shaking her head. "You know what your problem is? You're too damn sensitive. One little text, and you lose your mind like a kid throwing a tantrum. Do you think you can just storm off every time something doesn't go your way? One text." I repeated, my voice dropping low, simmering with anger. I turned to face her fully, meeting her glare head-on. "Rachel, this isn't about one text. It's everything, the lies, the sneaking around, the messages with this guy, the photos you sent. You've been hiding this for God knows how long, and now you want to act like I'm crazy." Her eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, I saw something flicker there, guilt, maybe. But just as quickly, it was gone. She was good at this, too good. She shifted her stance, falling back into that defensive tone I'd come to recognize. "I didn't lie," she fired back, shaking her head. "I was out with colleagues. Mark happens to be one of them. You've even met him, remember? At the Christmas party. But of course, you don't remember because you never pay attention to anything about my work. For a second, I froze, trying to recall the night she was talking about. Yeah, there was a guy at the Christmas party. Tall, broad-shouldered, with this smirk plastered on his face the whole time. Mark. I remembered him now. He tried making small talk, cracking lame jokes, even attempted to chat sports with me. I'd brushed him off, figuring he was just some random guy from her office. It never even crossed my mind that he could be a threat. But now, it all clicked into place, the late nights, the phone calls she'd step outside to take, the way she'd come home buzzing with energy after those work drinks. It had been him all along. You expect me to believe this is all just about work? I snapped, my voice rising despite trying to keep it steady. You're telling me you're out there drinking with this guy, texting him late at night, and that's just normal? Do you even hear yourself right now? She rolled her eyes, dropping her arms to her sides as she stepped closer, practically right in my face. It's called networking, Nick. I'm not going to sit at home every night like you do. I actually have a career I care about. Maybe if you weren't so busy sulking, you'd understand that. Her words hit me like a slap across the face, each one stinging more than the last. Networking. That's what she was calling it now. I couldn't see a trace of regret in her eyes, only sheer contempt. She wasn't upset because she felt guilty, she was angry because I had the nerve to confront her, to challenge her version of the story. I stepped back, shaking my head in disbelief. You really think I'm going to swallow that? That all the late nights, the lies, the sneaking around, it's just about work? Are you serious? Her eyes flashed, and I could see the fury building in her, like a storm rolling in fast. She was losing her grip on the situation, and she couldn't stand it. I don't owe you anything, Nick, she spat, her voice sharp and filled with venom. I told you nothing happened. If you can't accept that, maybe you should leave. Maybe that's the real issue here. I'm bored, Nick. I'm tired of you sitting around, playing detective in your own pathetic little life. That word, bored, hit harder than anything else she'd said. She was bored of me. I felt the anger bubbling up, pulsing through my veins, but deep down, I knew there was no point in continuing this conversation. She wasn't going to admit the truth. She wasn't going to apologize, and she definitely wasn't going to show any respect. Not anymore. So, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I walked past her, straight into the house and over to the kitchen table. I grabbed the notepad we usually used for grocery lists, scribbled a few words, then tossed it back onto the table and walked out the door without looking back. As I stepped off the porch, I could hear her shouting after me, her voice rising in frustration, demanding to know what I'd written. But I didn't turn around. I didn't care anymore. The note was simple, just friendly meetings, huh? I got in the car and drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring together as I tried to process everything. A storm of emotions churned inside me, anger, betrayal, disbelief, each one crashing into the next like waves in a rough sea. But beneath all that chaos, there was something colder, something that felt like an ending. It was well past midnight by the time I pulled into Eric's driveway. I hadn't called ahead, but it didn't matter. Eric and I had been best friends for years. He was the kind of guy who'd open his door at any hour, no questions asked. As soon as I knocked, the door swung open, and there he was, rubbing sleep from his eyes. But when he saw my face, his expression changed instantly, concern taking over. Jesus, Nick, what the hell happened? He asked, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't respond right away. I just walked past him, collapsing onto his couch, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones all at once. Eric took a seat across from me, watching me carefully. He didn't say a word, but I could tell he knew it was bad. He just didn't know how bad yet. I took a deep breath, running my hands over my face like I was trying to wipe away the whole situation. She's been cheating, man. Eric's expression shifted, his usual easygoing look replaced by something more serious and tense. Rachel? No way. Are you sure? I nodded, slowly but firmly. I found the messages, the photos. She's been lying about where she's been, saying she was working late. It's this guy, Mark, from her office. I saw everything, Eric. Every single thing. He didn't respond right away. Eric's never been the type to jump to conclusions without taking a moment to process, and I've always appreciated that about him. He let the silence linger for a bit before finally speaking. Did you confront her? I let out a laugh, but there was nothing funny about it. It was bitter, raw. Yeah, I did. And you know what? She didn't even bother denying it. Not really. Tried to spin it as, just friendly meetings, said I was the one overreacting, called me insecure and paranoid. And then she drops this bombshell, she's bored of me. Can you believe that? Bored. Eric leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck like he was trying to ease the tension building there. Damn, man. That's rough. I don't even know what to say. That's messed up. Yeah, no kidding, I shot back, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. I walked out. Packed a bag, left a note on the kitchen table that said, just friendly meetings, huh, and then I left. Eric gave a low whistle. Good. She had that coming. But Nick, what's your plan now? Are you thinking about going back, trying to sort this out, or? His question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. What was my next move? The truth was, I had no idea. Part of me wanted to storm back in there and tear her world apart, the same way she'd shattered mine. But the other part, the part that was exhausted, just wanted to walk away and never look back. I don't know, I admitted, my voice much softer now, almost a whisper. I thought leaving would make me feel better, but it didn't. I just feel empty. Like none of this is even real. Eric nodded, his expression sympathetic. Look, Nick, I've known you both for a long time. I get that this isn't something you can just move on from overnight. But you've got to start thinking about yourself. Staying with someone who disrespects you like that. It'll destroy you from the inside out. He was right. I knew he was right. But knowing it and accepting it were two different things entirely. I sat there, staring at the dimly lit living room, the silence stretching out between us like a chasm. After a while, Eric stood up, walked to the fridge, and came back with 2 beers. He handed one to me, and I took it, grateful to have something to do with my hands, even if it didn't ease the turmoil inside. Did she ever apologize? He asked after taking a long sip from his bottle. I shook my head slowly. No, not once. She just kept making excuses, saying I was blowing everything out of proportion, that I was acting like a crazy person. She wouldn't even acknowledge that what she did was wrong. Eric frowned, staring at the bottle in his hand like he was searching for the right words but hesitating to say them. What is it? I pressed, leaning forward. Just say it, man. He let out a deep sigh, finally meeting my eyes. You want to know what I think? I think she's been checked out of this marriage for a while. This guy, Mark, he's just a symptom of something bigger. The way she's treating you, the way she talks to you, that didn't just start tonight. You don't wake up one day and decide to become a cheating, lying. He trailed off, shaking his head as if to pull himself back. What I'm trying to say is, this isn't new. She's been looking for a way out, whether she's willing to admit it or not. I wanted to argue with him, to tell him he was wrong, that things hadn't been as bad as he was making it seem. But deep down, I knew he was right. The signs had been there for a while. I just didn't want to face them. I'd let her drift away, make excuses, dismiss me, and I let it happen because, deep down, maybe I didn't want to accept that the woman I fell in love with was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized anymore. Eric leaned in closer, his voice softer now, like he was trying not to push too hard. Look, man, you've got to figure out what's right for you. If you go back there and she keeps treating you this way, what's it going to do to you? Do you really believe she'll change, or is this just who she's become now? I stared down at the beer bottle in my hand, feeling the cool glass slick with condensation against my palm. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know what I wanted anymore. But one thing was starting to become painfully clear: the Rachel I once fell in love with was gone. And maybe she'd been gone longer than I realized. The next morning, I woke up on Eric's couch, and everything from the night before rushed back like a bad dream. Only it wasn't a dream, it was my reality now. I checked my phone, no missed calls, no messages. Rachel hadn't even bothered to find out where I was. That was the final nail in the coffin. Deep down, I knew it was over between us. Whatever connection we once had was shattered beyond repair, and I wasn't about to spend my life trying to piece it back together. I took a deep breath, and right then, I made my decision. I was done living under the weight of her lies. As the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, a cold, hard truth settled into my bones, the kind that leaves no room for second chances or empty promises of change. I sat up on the couch, staring blankly at the sunlight filtering in. The events of the night before were still fresh, like an open wound, but the pain had dulled. It was just a heavy, constant ache now. Eric had already left for work, but he'd left a note on the kitchen counter: "Call me if you need anything. Don't let her drag you back in, man." I read the note over and over, the words cutting deeper than they probably should have. Because that's exactly what I feared, that she'd somehow pull me back in. Rachel had a way of twisting things, getting under my skin, making me question everything. She didn't even need to apologize. One well-placed word, one calculated move, and I'd be doubting my own reality. But not this time. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I'd been dreading. I never thought I'd end up here, but life has a way of blindsiding you with punches you can't dodge forever. My finger hovered over the call button, my throat tightening with the weight of what I was about to do. "Just do it, Nick. Don't look back." The phone rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. "Hello, Carlson Law Firm. How may I assist you?" My voice cracked as I spoke. "Hi, I need to speak with someone about filing for divorce." The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, like they belonged to someone else's story, not mine. But the moment they left my lips, something shifted inside me, like a door closing, a line being drawn in the sand. There was no going back from this. And I realized, in that moment, I didn't want to go back. The receptionist transferred me to a lawyer named Diane, a sharp-sounding woman who wasted no time getting straight to business. "So, Mr. Carter," she said after I'd given her a quick rundown of the situation, "have you and your wife discussed the possibility of divorce, or is this your first move?" "No," I replied, swallowing hard. "I walked out last night. She doesn't know I'm making this call yet." There was a brief silence on the other end, like she was carefully choosing her next words. "I understand this must be incredibly difficult for you," she said, her voice steady but kind. "But you're taking the right step by getting informed first. I'll need to gather some more information from you, things like finances, property, any children involved." "No kids," I cut in, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. If there was one thing that made this whole mess a bit easier, it was that. Rachel and I had talked about having kids in the early years, but it was always a vague conversation, something we kept pushing off for later. Now, I couldn't imagine dragging a child through this disaster. "Good," she replied, her tone brisk but not unkind. "That should make things a bit simpler. Are you aiming for a quick separation, or do you have specific terms you want to negotiate?" I hesitated, trying to sort through the mess in my head. Images of Rachel from last night flashed in my mind, the anger, the contempt, the way she looked at me like I was nothing but an inconvenience. I felt a surge of bitterness well up inside me, but I swallowed it back down. This wasn't about getting even or acting out of spite. It was about finally choosing to put myself first. I just want out, I said quietly, gripping the phone tighter in my hand. I don't care about the house, the car. She can keep it all. I just need this to be over. Diane's voice softened slightly, losing its sharp edge. I get it, but let's take this one step at a time, okay? I'll start drafting the papers for a no-contest divorce, and we can go from there. I can tell you're ready to move on, but don't rush through this. Even if you want a clean break, it's important to make sure you're legally protected. I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. Yeah, okay. Just, let's get it done. We ended the call, and as I put the phone down, the heaviness in my chest didn't disappear, but it felt like it had shifted. It was a strange sensation. There was a finality in those words, something tangible in taking that first step to end our marriage. But it wasn't the feeling of satisfaction or freedom I expected. Instead, it was a deep, hollow sadness. This wasn't how our story was supposed to end. I thought we'd built something lasting, something strong enough to weather any storm. But in the end, it all crumbled like a flimsy house of cards. The hardest part was realizing I didn't even recognize who she'd become. Maybe I hadn't wanted to admit it before, but Eric was right. This wasn't just about Mark, or a few text messages, or one terrible night. It had been coming for a long time. Rachel had been slipping away from me for months, maybe even years, and I'd been too blind, or maybe just too hopeful, to see it. I grabbed my overnight bag from the floor and headed out to the car. But instead of driving back to Eric's place, I found myself starting the engine and heading towards the house, our house. I wasn't planning on talking to her. There was nothing left to say. I just needed to grab a few more things and face the reality of what was happening. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was still there, but something felt off. The living room curtains were drawn tight, and the place looked unusually quiet. I paused for a moment before stepping out of the car, walking slowly up the path to the front door. I hadn't really thought about what I'd do if she was home, but I didn't have it in me to argue with her again. I just wanted to grab my stuff and go. Simple. But the moment I opened the door, the silence inside hit me like a brick wall. No sound of the TV blaring in the background, no noise of her pacing around on a phone call, just a heavy, unsettling silence. My footsteps echoed as I moved through the house, heading straight for the bedroom. I started gathering more clothes, stuffing them into the bag without even looking up. And then I saw it. Right there on my side of the bed was a crumpled piece of paper. I froze, feeling my heart pound against my ribs as I stepped closer. I reached for it with a shaking hand, unfolding it slowly. It was the note I'd left the night before, just friendly meetings, huh? But now, scribbled across the bottom in Rachel's handwriting was a single word, goodbye. For a moment, I couldn't catch my breath. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just read. Was she gone? Had she actually left? I let the note fall from my hand and rushed through the house, checking every room as panic started to set in. Her clothes were gone. The bathroom was empty. Even the photos from the walls, the ones from vacations, our wedding, holidays together, they were missing. She'd cleared out, just like that. It all hit me at once, a cold, crushing wave of realization. Rachel hadn't stuck around to talk. She didn't try to explain, didn't apologize, didn't fight for anything. She just walked away, as if I was nothing, as if our life together had meant nothing. I stood there in the empty house, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. It wasn't just that the marriage was ending. No, Rachel had ended us long before I ever walked out the door. The emptiness of the house seemed to swallow me whole. I stared around the bedroom, looking at the empty closets, the bare dresser where her jewelry used to be scattered, and that crumpled note on the floor. Goodbye. One word, scribbled with the same detached coldness she'd shown me last night. It wasn't just the house that felt empty, it was me. I felt hollowed out, like everything I'd known, everything I'd built, had been ripped away in one swift, violent motion, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of what used to be. She was gone. Just like that. I should have felt something, anger, sorrow, relief, anything. But instead, there was just this overwhelming numbness, like my mind couldn't process it all yet. Rachel had left, taking her clothes, her belongings, and whatever shred of respect she had left for me. She didn't fight for us, didn't try to make things right. She just walked out, vanishing from my life as quickly as the trust between us had dissolved. I dropped the bag by the bed and sank onto the mattress, staring blankly at the floor, trying to make sense of it all. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. It was probably Eric checking in on me, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to anyone right now. Not when it felt like I was living in a slow-motion train wreck. How did it come to this? The woman I'd shared everything with, the one I thought I'd grow old beside, had packed up and left without a word. No closure, no final conversation, just silence. I couldn't help but think back to all the times we'd laughed together, the plans we'd made, those little moments that had once felt so significant. Now, they seemed like distant memories, almost like they happened to someone else. I got up, feeling like the walls were closing in on me, and wandered through the house like I was a stranger in my own home. The living room, where we'd spent countless nights watching movies and bickering over takeout, felt foreign now. The kitchen, where she'd always teased me about my terrible cooking, was cold and empty, the counters bare. Every room seemed filled with the emptiness she'd left behind, and it hit me like a punch in the gut. In the hallway, there was one photo still hanging on the wall. It was one of the few she hadn't taken. It was from our honeymoon, the two of us standing on a beach, her arm wrapped around me, both of us smiling like we didn't have a care in the world. I remembered that day so clearly, how she'd laughed when I tripped over a rock trying to set up the camera timer. Her laugh had been genuine then. The love had felt real. But looking at it now, it felt like I was staring at a couple of strangers. Who were those people? What happened to them? I took the photo down from the wall without even thinking about it and placed it face down on the table. I couldn't bear to look at it anymore. I couldn't keep clinging to something that was already gone. I drifted back into the kitchen, grabbed a glass from the cabinet, and filled it with water. As I stood there, I noticed her coffee mug, still sitting on the counter from that morning. It was like a part of her was still lingering in the house, a shadow of what used to be. I felt this sudden urge to throw it, to smash it against the wall and shatter it into 1,000 pieces, just to feel something. But I didn't. I couldn't even bring myself to care that much. Instead of smashing anything, I walked back to the table, picked up the crumpled note, and read it once more. That single word, goodbye. It should have stung, but instead, it brought a sense of clarity I'd been avoiding for far too long. This wasn't just about her cheating with Mark or the endless lies and disrespect. It was deeper than that. We'd been over long before I ever found those texts on her phone. We'd been going through the motions, pretending we were still that couple we used to be. But in reality, we were just shadows clinging to the memory of something that no longer existed. Goodbye wasn't just her leaving. It was the final nail in the coffin of a relationship that had been rotting away for years, no matter how much I tried to deny it. I tossed the note back onto the counter and stepped outside, needing space, needing to breathe. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the cool night air hit me as I walked out onto the porch. I just stood there for a moment, letting the chill cut through the haze in my mind. I stared out into the quiet street, wondering how everything could look so normal while my entire world had just been turned upside down. I sank down onto the porch steps, gazing up at the stars, trying to remember the last time I'd felt genuinely happy in this house. The truth hit me hard, I couldn't recall a single moment. Every memory I reached for now felt tainted, warped by the realization that I'd been holding on to something that had been dead for a long time. I thought back to what Eric had said last night, how this wasn't just about Mark, how Rachel had likely checked out a long time ago. He was right, even if it was painful to admit. I'd been clinging to the idea of who she was, who we were, without realizing she had already moved on in her mind, even if her body was still here until now. I leaned back against the porch railing, closing my eyes and letting the weight of everything settle in. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, feeling that strange, hollow calm that comes once the storm has passed. She was gone, and there was no use fighting it, no point in replaying every lie, every argument, every excuse. The door had closed on us, and I wasn't about to stand there pounding on it, begging for answers that would never come. Eventually, I got up and walked back inside. The house was dark and silent, and for the first time, I realized it no longer felt like home. It was just a building, four walls that had once held a life I couldn't recognize anymore. I grabbed my bag from the bedroom, slung it over my shoulder, and didn't bother looking back as I stepped into the night. One thing was clear, whatever came next, it wouldn't include her. This chapter of my life was done, and as much as it hurt to admit, there was a strange sense of freedom in that realization. No more lies, no more pretending, just me, finally walking away from the ghost of who she used to be. Goodbye, I thought, echoing her last word in my mind. But this time, it wasn't laced with bitterness. It felt like a release. I climbed into my car, turned the key, and drove off, leaving behind not just a house, but everything we had once been. There was no turning back now, only the open road stretching out in front of me. The faint glow of the city lights flickered on the horizon, distant and unreachable, like another world entirely. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was ready to face it, whatever it was, wherever it led. I kept driving, not caring where the road would take me. The silence inside the car felt suffocating, but it was still better than the silence that filled that empty house. I had no destination in mind, but my hands clutched the steering wheel, forcing me to keep moving forward. The last few hours, hell, the last few months, had been a whirlwind of lies, accusations, and emotional wreckage that I couldn't begin to sort out. There was no moment of clarity, no epiphany telling me it was all going to be okay. Just this numb, hollow ache that had settled deep in my bones and refused to go away. I pulled into a random gas station on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering like something out of a low-budget horror film. I hadn't eaten since yesterday, and my stomach felt like it was twisted into knots. I parked the car and leaned back, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time I felt anything other than this crushing weight of betrayal. What now? The question lingered in my mind, but no answers surfaced. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting into my skin. The gas station had one of those 24-hour convenience stores, the kind that sold stale sandwiches and coffee that tasted like motor oil. I wasn't hungry, but I walked inside anyway, feeling like I was drifting through a haze, going through the motions just to keep myself grounded. The guy behind the counter barely glanced at me, too absorbed in flipping through a magazine. He didn't care. No one did, and maybe that was the point. This was something I had to face on my own. I grabbed a bottle of water, paid without a word, and walked back outside, taking a deep breath of the cold night air. The stars had disappeared behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the chill had deepened, sinking into my bones. Everything felt colder now. I leaned against the side of my car, sipping the water and staring out at the dark stretch of highway. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the silence. I pulled it out, expecting it to be Eric checking in again, but it wasn't him. It was Rachel. I just stared at the screen for a moment, her name glowing there like a harsh reminder of everything that had unraveled. The last thing I wanted was to hear her voice, to listen to more empty excuses or fake apologies. I was done with that. But some part of me, the part still entangled in the mess of our shared past, couldn't resist. Maybe I was looking for closure. Maybe I wanted her to admit what she did. Or maybe I was just hoping she'd say something that could make sense of this chaos. I answered the call, keeping my voice flat and steady. What? There was a brief silence on the other end before her voice came through, soft and strained. Nick, I'm sorry. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar wave of anger rise up inside me. Her words sounded empty, hollow. I'd heard her say sorry 1,000 times before, for small things, for silly arguments we used to laugh about. But this wasn't something a simple sorry could patch up. For what? I asked, my voice cold and sharp. Sorry you got caught. Sorry you didn't cover your tracks better. What exactly are you sorry for, Rachel? She hesitated, and I could almost hear her brain working, trying to decide what angle to take next. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she finally said, her voice cracking a bit. I don't know how it happened. Everything just got so complicated, and Complicated? I cut her off, my anger boiling over. You're calling it complicated? You lied to me for months, maybe longer. You cheated on me, Rachel. That's not complicated, that's betrayal. I know, she sobbed, her voice breaking, filled with a panic I hadn't heard before. I know, Nick, I messed up. I don't even know why I did it, okay? Things haven't been right between us for a while. I felt like I was drowning, and I didn't know how to fix it. And then Mark. The moment she said his name, a surge of pure rage shot through me. Mark. Just hearing her say his name made my blood boil. I clenched my fist around the phone, fighting the urge to throw it across the parking lot. Stop, I said, my voice low and dangerous. I don't want to hear about him. I don't want your excuses about how I wasn't enough or how things got tough. You really think you can justify what you did just because you felt bored? I wasn't bored, she replied, her voice cracking now. I was scared that we were falling apart, that I wasn't enough for you anymore. I know it sounds stupid, but I was terrified you didn't love me the same way, and You were afraid I didn't love you? I almost laughed, the disbelief thick in my voice. The nerve she had. She was the one sneaking around, sending those messages, doing who knows what with Mark, and now she was trying to spin this as her being afraid. Rachel, I gave everything to this marriage. Everything. And you threw it all away because you were scared. No, don't try to paint yourself as the victim here. The silence that followed was heavy, and for a moment, I thought she might have hung up. But then I heard her take a shaky breath. I know I messed up, she whispered, her voice so small I barely heard it. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know what to say. I never meant to hurt you. Well, you did, I replied, my tone flat and unfeeling. You've destroyed everything we built together. I heard her voice crack. I still love you, she whispered, the words so faint they were almost lost in the night. But I didn't believe her. Maybe she believed it in her own twisted way, but love isn't supposed to feel like this. Love doesn't leave you hollow, shattered, picking up the pieces of a life you thought you knew. Love doesn't destroy you while the other person walks away without looking back. I don't care, I said, my voice hard and final. I'm filing for divorce. We're done. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, shaky and uneven, like she was trying to hold back tears. But I didn't feel pity. I felt nothing at all. Okay, she whispered, her voice small, defeated. I understand. I hung up the phone without another word. There was no reason to drag this out any longer. It was finished. The final thread that had been holding us together, frayed and fragile as it was, had finally snapped. I stood there in the empty parking lot, staring down at my phone as the reality of what had just happened sank in. There was no turning back now, no more waiting for her to change, no more hoping for an apology that could make any of this better. The life I had with Rachel was over, and with that phone call, I had cut the last tie that connected me to it. For the first time, I felt a strange kind of clarity wash over me. It wasn't happiness, and it wasn't relief, just a sharp, cold realization. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to save. The fall was complete, but maybe, just maybe, I was ready to start climbing back up. After I ended the call, the silence wrapped itself around me like a thick fog in the cold night air. I leaned against the side of the car, staring off into the distance, waiting for some kind of emotion to hit me, anger, sadness, regret. But nothing came. Just the same dull, empty feeling that had been gnawing at me since I left that house. Rachel was gone. The conversation was over. The marriage, the future I had once imagined for us, it was all gone. And the strangest part was, I hadn't even tried to stop it. The phone was still clutched in my hand, but I didn't want to look at it anymore. I dropped it onto the passenger seat, shut the car door, and started walking. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and dark, while the neon lights of the gas station flickered behind me like a distant memory. My footsteps echoed against the asphalt, each step feeling heavier than the last. And with every step, I realized I was walking away from more than just a broken relationship. I was walking away from the man I used to be, her husband, the guy who believed in forever, who trusted, who thought love could fix anything. That man was gone now, left behind on this lonely stretch of road, along with all the shattered pieces of my old life. The truth was, I had no idea who I was anymore or who I was supposed to become. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going back. I kept walking, the cold seeping through my jacket, but it wasn't enough to shake me out of the fog. My mind kept drifting back to the phone call, her voice small and shaky, still ringing in my ears, "I still love you." Those words. I didn't know if she even believed them herself, but a part of me almost did. Or maybe it was just that piece of me still clinging to the memory of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, the one who wasn't a liar, a cheat, or a stranger. But that woman was gone now. Maybe she never even existed. I stopped in the middle of the road, staring up at the sky. The clouds had broken apart, revealing a scattering of stars twinkling faintly above. They looked so far away, just like everything in my life right now. The life I thought I'd built with Rachel was distant too, already fading into a memory I could barely hold on to. What was I supposed to do now? I didn't have a plan, no clear path ahead, just a void where our future used to be. There was no going back to that house, no going back to her. And even if I could, what was the point? She'd made her choice, and now I was making mine. I turned around and headed back toward the gas station, my breath escaping in slow, foggy puffs. There was a heaviness pressing down on me that I couldn't shake, but underneath it all, there was something else, something small and barely noticeable, like the flicker of a tiny flame. Maybe it was hope. Not for what I'd lost, but for whatever might come next. I slid back into the car, the cold air clinging to me as I gripped the steering wheel. The dark road stretched out in front of me, endless and unknown. The world felt bigger than it had in a long time, like I was standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain. It was terrifying, but it also felt like a chance to rebuild, to find out who I could be without her. I didn't start the car right away. I just sat there, thinking about what Eric had said the night before, how Rachel had checked out of our marriage long before Mark ever came into the picture. He was right, of course. I'd been holding on to this idea of us for far too long, convincing myself that things would get better, that we could fix it. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd known it for a while, but I just didn't want to face it. Rachel had let go of our marriage, but in a way, so had I. I'd stopped fighting for what we used to be, letting the silence and distance grow between us day by day. Maybe that's why her betrayal hurt so much, because it wasn't just her that had destroyed us. We both had. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I landed on Eric's name. My thumb hovered over the call button, and for a moment, I almost didn't press it. But then I did. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice groggy but filled with concern. "Nick, you okay?" "I'm fine," I lied, knowing he wouldn't believe me. I talked to her." There was a pause, and then he let out a deep sigh. "And?" "She's gone," I said quietly. "She left the house, cleared out. I guess it's really over now." Eric didn't respond right away. He wasn't the type to throw out empty platitudes or try to sugarcoat things. Instead, he just said, "I'm sorry, man." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, me too. Where are you?" "Some gas station on the outskirts of town," I replied, glancing out at the empty road. "I don't even know where I'm headed." "You don't need to know right now," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Just come back here. We'll figure it out in the morning." There was something comforting in the way he spoke, like he didn't expect me to have all the answers or to be okay. He wasn't trying to fix it, he was just there. "Yeah," I said, turning the key in the ignition. "I'll be there soon." The drive back to Eric's place was quiet, the darkness of the night settling in around me like a familiar blanket. But this time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It wasn't the stifling kind that had settled between Rachel and me for so long. It was just stillness, a calm I hadn't felt in ages. I knew one thing for sure, I was leaving more than just a relationship behind. I was leaving behind the person I used to be, her husband, the guy who believed in forever, who trusted blindly, who thought love could conquer anything. That version of me was gone now, left behind on this empty stretch of road along with all the broken pieces of my old life. I pulled into Eric's driveway, his old pickup truck parked in its usual spot beside the house. The place was dark, but I knew he'd still be up. When I knocked, the door creaked open, and there he was, standing there with tired eyes but a look of pure understanding. "Tough night?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. "You have no idea," I muttered, dropping my bag by the door. We didn't say much after that. Eric handed me a beer, and we settled on the couch in silence, the TV playing some late-night rerun we both ignored. For the first time in what felt like ages, I didn't feel the urge to fill the quiet with words. I knew the road ahead was going to be rough. There'd be the legal battles, the divorce, splitting up everything we'd built together. And then, there'd be the slow, painful process of figuring out who I was without her. But sitting there in the quiet with a friend who understood without needing explanations, I felt something stir inside me, not joy, not relief, but the smallest flicker of hope. The first light of dawn peeked through the blinds, casting slivers of sunlight across the living room floor. I was still slouched on Eric's couch, an empty beer bottle resting on the floor beside me. I hadn't slept, not really. My mind had been spinning all night, replaying memories, regrets, and endless what-ifs like a broken movie reel. But as the sunlight cut through the shadows, something inside me shifted. The heavy darkness that had clung to me for weeks, maybe even months, was starting to lift. Not completely, but enough that I could finally breathe, enough that I could see a small glimmer of a way forward. Eric was passed out in the armchair, his head tilted back at an awkward angle. I couldn't help but let out a soft chuckle. He'd stayed up with me all night, never once pushing me to talk more than I wanted to. I didn't feel like I deserved a friend like him, but I was damn grateful he was there. He didn't need to say anything, just his presence was enough to let me know I wasn't facing this alone. I got up quietly and stepped outside onto the small front porch. The air was crisp, the early morning chill biting but oddly refreshing. For the first time in what felt like forever, I stood there, letting the stillness of the world settle over me. No chaos, no noise screaming in my head, no texts from Rachel, no lies hanging over me like a storm cloud, just quiet. I leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the empty street as the sky shifted from deep purple to a soft, pale blue. It was the start of a new day, and for the first time, I felt its promise. Standing there, I realized something important. I'd been so focused on everything I'd lost that I hadn't even considered what I might gain. Yeah, it hurt. It all hurt, the betrayal, the lies, the cold finality of that last call with Rachel. It had ripped me apart in ways I wasn't sure I could ever fully repair. But as the early morning light warmed my face, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was in control of something, my own life. The marriage was over. It had been dead long before I found those messages. Rachel had left, emotionally and now physically, and there was no going back to what we once had. But what I hadn't seen until this moment was that this wasn't just the end of us, it was the start of something new for me. I'd been defined by that relationship for so long, by the love we shared, the fights, the desperate attempts to hold on when everything was crumbling, that I'd lost sight of who I was outside of it. But now, with nothing left to cling to, I realized I was free to figure myself out again. Free to start fresh. The thought wasn't as terrifying as it had been last night. It didn't feel like a pit in my stomach or a crushing weight on my chest. Instead, it felt like a challenge, like an opportunity one hadn't seen before. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I could see past the pain. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts again. Rachel's name was still there, but this time, I didn't linger on it. I kept scrolling, past the memories, past the hurt of what she'd done, until I landed on a different name, my sister, Megan. We hadn't spoken much lately, mostly because I'd been too wrapped up in my own mess, too focused on Rachel and trying to hold everything together. But now, I needed to reconnect with the people who truly mattered, the ones who were real and solid, not just echoes of what used to be. I dialed Megan's number, and after a few rings, she answered, her voice groggy from sleep. "Nick, what time is it?" "Early," I admitted, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "Sorry, I needed to talk." I hesitated, not knowing where to start. "A lot's been happening." There was a pause, and then her tone softened with genuine concern. "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath, and for the first time in a while, the weight of everything eased up just a little. "No, but I think I will be." We talked for the next hour, not just about Rachel or the betrayal, but about everything. I told her how I'd felt trapped for so long, how I'd been losing myself bit by bit without even realizing it. Megan listened, never interrupting, just letting me unload all the emotions I'd been bottling up for months. When I finally stopped talking, she spoke softly, her voice filled with the kind of understanding I hadn't felt in ages. "Nick, I've sensed something was off for a while. I didn't want to push you, but I could tell. I'm sorry you went through all of this on your own, but you don't have to anymore." Her words hit me hard. She was right. I didn't have to go through this alone, not anymore. I had people who cared about me, people who would stand by me while I figured out how to rebuild, who wouldn't judge me for falling apart. "I know," I replied, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. "Thanks, Megan." We chatted a little longer, making plans to meet up that weekend. When I finally hung up, I felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but lighter, like I'd taken the first real step towards something new. I stood on the porch for a bit longer, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet street. The world seemed bigger now, filled with possibilities I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about rebuilding and finding out what came next. And for the first time, I felt ready to face it. Eric eventually woke up and joined me outside, squinting against the morning sun, still half asleep. He handed me a cup of fresh coffee, his unspoken way of letting me know he was there for me. "You good?" he asked, taking a sip of his own coffee. I nodded, staring out at the horizon. "I think I will be." We sat there in companionable silence, the morning stretching out before us like a blank canvas. I had no idea what the future held, but for once, that didn't scare me. I was okay with not knowing. I didn't need all the answers right now, I just needed to keep moving forward. And as the sun rose higher, I made a promise to myself, I wasn't going to let this break me. I wasn't going to let Rachel's betrayal define the rest of my life. I had hit rock bottom, but I was determined to rise from it, not for her, not to prove anything to anyone else, but for myself. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There'd be plenty of tough days, filled with lingering pain and the slow process of healing. But I was done living in the shadows of what once was. I was ready to step out into the light and start living for what could be. With that thought in mind, I took my first real step forward, into the rest of my life.